A loyal senior executive is publicly ignored and humiliated during a critical presentation, but instead of reacting emotionally, he begins setting a quiet chain of events in motion that will expose power, arrogance, and misplaced authority one step at a time. My name is Raymond Collins, and I've spent the last 19 years working at Northridge Solutions, Inc. 19 years is long enough to watch a company grow from a shaky mid-tier operation into a national firm with polished offices, corporate slogans, and executives who forget how fragile success really is. I joined Northridge when we were still fighting to be taken seriously, when every contract felt like survival. I stayed because I believed in the work and because I believed loyalty still meant something. Over the years, I worked my way up to senior strategy manager. I wasn't flashy, I wasn't loud, I didn't campaign for promotions. I built my reputation quietly through data, risk assessments, and reports that executives relied on when decisions carried real consequences. Mergers, market exits, restructurings, my fingerprints were on all of them. I never needed applause. I believed experience spoke for itself. I was wrong. The morning everything changed started like any other. Black coffee, a familiar tie, the same drive into headquarters I'd made thousands of times before. But this time, I was carrying something heavier than a laptop. Inside that presentation was data that didn't just predict risk, it warned of collapse, market exposure, regulatory blind spots, strategic overreach. If Northridge didn't change course, we weren't talking about a bad quarter. We were talking about damage that couldn't be undone. The boardroom was full when I walked in. 15 executives, polished shoes, confident smiles, people who liked to talk about vision without ever reading footnotes. I connected my laptop, took a breath, and began. At first, everything seemed normal. Slides advanced, charts appeared. I explained the projections slowly, carefully, the way you do when the truth is uncomfortable. Then, chairs started moving. One executive checked his phone, another whispered something and stood up, a third followed. Within minutes, one by one, they walked out. No confrontation, no apology, just excuses thrown over shoulders. Urgent call, another meeting, we'll catch the summary. I kept speaking, even as the room emptied. Every chair that became vacant felt louder than the last. 15 years of experience, 18, 19 years, being dismissed without a single question asked. They weren't just ignoring my presentation, they were ignoring the warning, and worse, they were ignoring me. By the time I reached the final slide, there were more empty seats than people left in the room. I finished anyway, slowly, professionally. I answered the silence with silence of my own. When it was over, no one clapped, no one commented. The meeting ended without a word. I closed my laptop. I didn't feel angry, not yet. What I felt was clarity, because moments like this don't happen by accident. They happen when people start believing titles matter more than truth, and when experience becomes inconvenient. I stepped into the hallway, leaned against the glass wall, and stared down at my phone. There was one number I hadn't called in a long time, not because I couldn't, but because I never needed to, until now. I dialed Charles Harper. Charles wasn't on the board. He wasn't an executive. He didn't sit in meetings or wear company badges, but he was Northridge's largest strategic partner, the man whose investments, contracts, and long memory quietly shaped the company's future. When Charles spoke, people listened, whether they admitted it or not. He answered on the second ring. "Raymond," he said calmly, "this is unexpected." "So was today," I replied. There was a pause, not awkward, curious. "I just finished presenting information Northridge needed to hear. It wasn't heard." Another pause, longer this time. "What kind of information?" he asked. "The kind that determines whether loyalty is rewarded or punished, and whether confidence turns into arrogance." Charles didn't interrupt. He never did.
I see, I finished, before decisions are made without consequences being understood. Silence filled the line. Then he spoke, quiet, measured, dangerous in its restraint. I see, he said. Thank you for telling me. The call ended. No promises, no reassurance, just those 4 words. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and looked through the glass at the empty boardroom. They thought the meeting was over. It wasn't, because the most important conversations rarely happen in the room where people walk out.
The day after the boardroom humiliation, I walked into the office with the calm of a man who had already decided how the game would unfold. 15 executives had dismissed my presentation, but their ignorance didn't frighten me. It fueled a quiet certainty that the system, when used correctly, could expose arrogance faster than any confrontation ever could. I knew something they didn't. Real influence often happens outside the room, in subtle maneuvers, in phone calls that change decisions without a single witness. I spent the morning going through emails, reviewing the strategic plans I had quietly prepared for months, and making a mental map of the executives' decisions that had contributed to Northridge's current vulnerabilities. Each report, each analysis, each spreadsheet I had compiled wasn't just data, it was leverage. And leverage, when wielded thoughtfully, can topple even the most confident egos. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the bitter warmth remind me why patience is an underrated weapon. By mid-morning, I was ready. I stepped into my office, closed the door, and dialed Charles Harper again. This time, my tone carried more than information, it carried intent. "Charles," I began, letting the words hang for a moment, "I need you to see something Northridge's executives refused to acknowledge yesterday." There was a pause on the other side, long enough to let anticipation build. That pause told me that I had his full attention. "Go on," he said, finally, calm yet alert. I forwarded him the presentation slides, the full report, and an accompanying memo that detailed risk projections with financial impact estimates and potential legal exposure. I watched his reaction through the silence on the line, imagining him scanning through the documents, connecting the dots they had ignored. This is significant," he said after a moment, his voice low, deliberate. "This is exactly why our contracts with Northridge need oversight. They can't afford missteps like this." I let him pause again, allowing the gravity to settle. "Exactly," I said, "and the people who ignored this yesterday need to understand the consequences of that dismissal, calmly, professionally, systematically." By noon, I had mapped my next moves. I wasn't angry, I was calculating. Revenge in a corporate environment isn't about shouting or dramatic confrontations. It's about patience, precision, and timing. It's about ensuring the people who underestimate you pay the price without ever realizing who set it in motion. I reached out to internal allies, people whose loyalty was based on respect for professionalism, not fear of titles. I didn't explain my plan, I simply provided them with the documentation that highlighted systemic risks the executives had overlooked. They didn't need persuasion. Once they saw the potential fallout, they became my silent partners. Then I contacted a few key clients. I didn't threaten, I didn't brag. I simply informed them of the current strategic status of Northridge, the precise areas of vulnerability, and offered reassurance that proper oversight could prevent operational failures. It was neutral, factual, but unsettling, especially to clients who trusted Northridge implicitly. Meanwhile, the 15 executives continued their routines, blissfully unaware that the events of the previous day had started a domino effect they couldn't see. Their confidence was based on assumption that everyone inside Northridge accepted their authority, that experience without a title was irrelevant. They were wrong. By mid-afternoon, whispers began circulating, subtle questions from clients, cautious inquiries from strategic partners, internal requests for clarification from teams who had previously deferred to authority rather than fact. Nothing overt, nothing confrontational, just the slow, almost imperceptible unraveling of certainty. And each ripple of doubt pointed straight back to the one person they had dismissed, me. I leaned back in my chair, letting the tension build. The executives would soon realize that power isn't always in presence or posture. It's in understanding the rules, the system, and the leverage that comes from knowledge. 15 people had walked out yesterday. Today, their mistakes were quietly being exposed, and they didn't even know it yet. Then, late in the afternoon, I made my next move, a phone call that would shift the narrative entirely. I called Northridge's regional regulatory advisor, someone whose word carries authority over corporate boards and strategic decisions. I didn't complain, I didn't accuse, I simply provided a concise, factual report of yesterday's events and offered documentation of the risks ignored. There was a long silence on the line. Then the advisor asked, "Are you suggesting these executives are unaware of the full scope?" "I'm suggesting," I replied evenly, "that they may need a reminder before external parties are forced to intervene." That statement hung in the air like a shadow. The advisor knew exactly what it meant. The company's reputation, contracts at operational security were now on the line, and the executives were walking blindly towards exposure. By the time I hung up, the dominoes were already tipping. Internal memos were circulating, partners were asking questions, teams were reviewing decisions they had previously accepted without scrutiny, and the board, they were blissfully unaware that the storm had already begun to form. The lesson was becoming clear, even to me. Revenge in a corporate setting isn't about anger. It's about strategic patience, about letting the system you understand work while those blinded by ego stumble. 15 executives had walked out, one quiet, deliberate chain of actions, and one patient, calculated voice was about to redefine the outcome of their arrogance. And I was just getting started. The real shift began the following morning. When I walked into Northridge Solutions that day, something felt different in the air. Conversations stopped a little faster. Eyes lingered a little longer. Confidence, once loud and unquestioned, had softened into caution. I didn't need confirmation. I could feel it. The system was responding exactly as I had anticipated. At 9:17 a.m., an internal memo hit executive inboxes. Subject: Urgent review of strategic risk oversight. I wasn't copied on it. I didn't need to be. Within minutes, department heads began requesting clarification meetings. Project managers postponed decisions they had rushed just days earlier. And for the first time in years, the executives who had walked on me were no longer setting the tone. They were reacting to it. By 10:30, my phone buzzed. It was Melissa Grant, one of the 15. "Ray," she said, forcing calm into her voice, "are you available for a quick conversation?" Quick. That word always amused me. Conversations are only quick when one side has nothing to lose. "Of course," I replied evenly. She came to my office 10 minutes later, closed the door herself, and sat across from me, not as an authority figure, but as someone recalculating her position. "There are concerns," she began. "External partners have raised questions about risk exposure. The board wants context." I nodded slowly. "That's understandable." She hesitated. "Your presentation yesterday, can you walk me through those projections again?" Yesterday, they walked out. Today, they needed explanations. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply opened the same report they had dismissed and began explaining it, calmly, professionally, methodically. Every number landed harder now. Every ignored warning carried weight. When I finished, Melissa exhaled. "This changes things," she admitted. "Yes, it does." By lunchtime, 3 more executives requested meetings. Same pattern, same urgency, different tone. Titles suddenly meant less than clarity, and each conversation reinforced a quiet truth. They hadn't underestimated the problem, they had underestimated me. Then came the call that truly mattered. At 4:24 p.m., Charles Harper rang. "Ray," he said, The board has convened an emergency review. Regulatory advisors are involved. They want someone with institutional knowledge in the room. I already knew what he was going to say. Still, I let the silence stretch. They want you, he finished. There it was. 15 years of experience, 2 decades of systems knowledge, and suddenly, the man they had dismissed was essential again. I'll attend. As long as it's clear, I'm there to advise, not to absorb blame. That's already been agreed. Quietly. The board meeting was scheduled for the next morning. That night, I didn't celebrate. I reviewed timelines. I refined risk summaries. I prepared not to attack, but to expose. Corporate revenge isn't loud. It's surgical. You don't destroy people directly. You let their decisions speak for them in rooms where consequences are real. The boardroom felt colder the next day. The same executives sat around the table, but their posture had changed. No crossed arms, no dismissive glances. When I entered, conversations stopped. I spoke for 37 minutes. No accusations, no emotions, just facts, timelines, ignored warnings, and documented decisions. When I finished, the room was silent. Then the board chair asked the question that shifted everything. Why were these risks not escalated earlier? No one answered. I didn't need them to, because silence in corporate rooms is louder than blame. By the end of the meeting, an independent audit was approved. Oversight committees were formed. Strategic authority was temporarily reassigned, and for the first time in years, accountability had names attached to it. As the executives filed out, none of them met my eyes. They didn't need to. They already understood the lesson. You don't sideline experience without consequences. You don't mistake quiet professionalism for weakness, and you don't walk out on someone who knows how the system really works. Because when the system turns, it remembers exactly who ignored the warning signs. And this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the reckoning.
The next morning, the office buzzed with a quiet urgency I hadn't seen before. My presence wasn't just noted, it was respected, feared even, though subtly. 15 executives who had strutted in with smug confidence just days earlier now walked cautiously, checking their messages, stealing glances toward me as if they expected the floor to collapse beneath them. And in a way, it had. The system, the rules, the procedures, the logic of accountability was finally holding them accountable. By 9 a.m., I was already in the boardroom. Documents neatly stacked, presentations queued, notes highlighted. Every spreadsheet, every analysis, every timeline I had painstakingly prepared was ready. I didn't need to embellish. Facts are brutal when ignored, and I had enough to ensure the consequences would be felt without me raising my voice. The meeting began. The board chair opened the session, a mix of hesitation and urgency in her tone. She briefly acknowledged me, then asked the first of many pointed questions. Raymond, what are the implications if these risks are left unaddressed? I answered methodically, not a hint of emotion. I laid out worst-case scenarios, financial impacts, client relations threats, and potential regulatory penalties. Each point landed like a weight on the table, and I could see the executives shift uncomfortably, papers sliding, pens pausing mid-note. Every silent glance between them spoke louder than any rebuttal could. By mid-morning, the tension became palpable. The executives who had walked out were forced to confront their negligence. Every question I posed, every clarification I demanded highlighted the gaps they had ignored yesterday. Their attempts to downplay the data were weak, their excuses transparent. The room's energy had shifted from dismissive arrogance to constrained panic. Then came the moment I had been waiting for, the perfect leverage point. According to the audit trail, I said, letting my voice remain steady, the decisions regarding high-risk projects were not reviewed by the appropriate committees, and the responsible executives approved resource allocations without verifying compliance documentation. The records are time-stamped and the approvals logged. This is not opinion, it is documented fact. Eyes widened, faces paled. Not a single executive could deny what was written in the logs they themselves had signed. For the first time, they were forced to see the direct consequences of their hubris. This was the silent, inevitable judgment I had been setting in motion since the day they walked on me. The board chair spoke, her tone tight but authoritative. Given these findings, we must implement immediate oversight changes. Certain approvals will require dual verification. Risk committees will be reinforced. And, she paused, looking directly at the executives who had dismissed my presentation, executive accountability will be formally noted in performance reviews. A murmur spread across the table. My colleagues who had supported me quietly nodded, barely hiding their satisfaction. And the 15 executives, they absorbed the news in silence. They knew what it meant. Reputations tarnished, influence diminished, and credibility questioned. All of this without a single accusation coming from me. I closed my presentation with the final slide, a visual timeline showing exactly when risks were ignored, decisions made without oversight, and approvals rubber-stamped without verification. The room was quiet. The only sound was the soft hum of the projector. The lesson was clear. The consequences weren't abstract. They were immediate, measurable, and inescapable. After the meeting, I returned to my office. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Colleagues I had mentored for years approached me quietly, offering thanks or just acknowledging with a nod that the balance of authority had changed. And somewhere in the building, the executives who had dismissed me yesterday were realizing that the world doesn't always respond to arrogance. It responds to preparation, precision, and the patient application of experience. By late afternoon, I received a message from Charles Harper, short, direct, unmistakable. They're reconsidering leadership roles. Your input made the difference. That message wasn't praise, it was confirmation. My strategy had worked. Revenge in the corporate world isn't about drama. It's about calculated impact, about letting the system you understand enforce accountability while those who underestimated you scramble to react. And yet, this was far from over. I wasn't done, not by a long shot. The executives still had positions, still had influence, still had resources, but the groundwork was laid. Every misstep, every hasty decision, every ignored warning was now documented and unavoidable. The next steps would ensure the lessons were remembered long after today. Later that evening, as I left the office, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. I hadn't yelled, I hadn't sabotaged equipment, I hadn't leaked information. I had done something far more powerful. I had played the long game, using the system they ignored as my instrument of revenge. And in that moment, I realized the beauty of it, the elegance of watching consequences unfold while maintaining control, dignity, and professionalism. For years, I had witnessed ambition unchecked, ego prioritized over experience, and titles mistaken for competence. Now, in this quiet reckoning, the narrative had shifted, and the executives who had walked out, they were learning a lesson I would never have to speak aloud. Respecting experience has a cost, and sometimes the most devastating revenge is simply being the one who knows how the system really works. The story wasn't finished yet. There were still contracts to review, partners to reassure, and reputations to rehabilitate. But one thing was clear. 15 executives had learned, the hard way, that their assumptions about me were dangerously wrong. And that knowledge, once internalized, would linger far longer than any single meeting ever could.
The fallout began almost immediately after the boardroom showdown. I had expected it, planned for it, but seeing it unfold in real time was different. The executives who had walked out on me suddenly faced scrutiny they couldn't dodge. Every misstep, every ignored report, every decision they had made in ignorance of real risk now carried weight and consequences. The very same arrogance that had allowed them to dismiss 19 years of experience now became their undoing. By mid-morning, internal audits were underway. Departments that had operated on autopilot, relying on titles instead of verification, suddenly had to produce documentation for every project decision. Those 15 executives were forced into a corner. Emails, approvals, and signatures that had once seemed routine were now examined under a microscope. I watched quietly from my office, letting the system take its course. No confrontation, no finger-pointing, just the inevitable unfolding of accountability. Then came the calls from external partners. Strategic clients who had once relied on Northridge without question were now asking pointed questions, requesting reassurances, demanding evidence. Their tone was professional, calm but firm, and they were no longer satisfied with empty assurances. Every client wanted proof that decisions were made with full awareness of risks, that the oversight the executives had neglected was being rectified. And there it was again, the silent power of preparation. Because I had documented everything meticulously, I had the proof. By the afternoon, the executives began to realize the depth of the storm. One by one, department heads began approaching me, not for advice, but for alignment. Even those who had opposed me previously now sought my input quietly, acknowledging without words that I held the knowledge they lacked. I didn't gloat. I merely provided guidance, ensuring that the work continued efficiently, but subtly highlighting the gaps caused by their oversight. The final domino fell around 3:15 p.m., when Charles Harper called me directly. "Raymond," he said, voice calm but deliberate, "the board has decided to restructure responsibilities. Certain executives will be reassigned, some placed under review, and a few, well, they're being considered for termination if corrective actions aren't taken immediately." I allowed a pause, letting the weight of his words settle. That was the moment, the payoff I had orchestrated with precision. 15 executives dismissed my presentation, underestimated experience, and now, quietly, methodically, they were paying the price. "Understood," I replied. "I'll continue to ensure that operations remain compliant and transparent." The next few days were surreal. Executives who had once carried themselves with unshakable confidence now moved cautiously, consulting me for input on decisions they had previously made unilaterally. Strategic clients praised Northridge for taking corrective action swiftly, unaware that a single patient professional had orchestrated the course of accountability behind the scenes. And internally, teams began to view experience and preparation with newfound respect, something I had long known to be more powerful than titles or ego. Then came the moment that solidified the lesson, the board's formal announcement. Responsibilities were redistributed, oversight committees were empowered, and the executives who had walked out of my presentation were officially placed on probation or reassigned to roles with reduced authority. Their reputations, once untouchable in the eyes of peers, now carried blemishes that could not easily be erased. I received an email from Melissa Grant, one of the 15. "Ray, I want to acknowledge your professionalism and thoroughness. You've reminded us all that expertise is not defined by title, but by knowledge and integrity. Thank you." I didn't respond immediately. I didn't need to. The message itself was a confirmation of everything I had worked to accomplish: silent, precise, devastatingly effective accountability. By the end of the week, Northridge had regained stability. Operations were verified, client trust restored, and risk protocols strengthened. And I returned to my office, closed the door, and allowed myself a quiet moment of satisfaction. Not triumph in the traditional sense, but the deeper satisfaction of having orchestrated justice within the rules of the system. The revenge had been subtle, surgical, unstoppable, and utterly deserved. The executives who had underestimated me would never forget the lesson. They had walked out on experience, dismissed preparation, and ignored wisdom. In return, they had learned the hard way that consequences follow ignorance, and that patience, knowledge, and strategic foresight are far more powerful than titles or arrogance. And as I looked out the office window that evening, the sun casting long shadows across the building, I realized that revenge doesn't always have to be loud, dramatic, or destructive. Sometimes it is enough to understand the system, let it work, and let those who misjudge you stumble on the paths they paved themselves. The silence of their regret was the ultimate echo of victory. 15 executives had walked out. One patient professional had turned their arrogance into accountability. And in that quiet, calculated revenge, the lesson was crystal clear. Never underestimate the power of experience. Weeks passed, but the effects of that one presentation rippled through Northridge Solutions like an undercurrent that no executive could escape. The 15 who had walked out were still recalibrating, quietly adjusting to new responsibilities, monitoring every decision, double-checking approvals, and learning to respect processes they had once dismissed. The lesson was embedded, permanent, inescapable, and quietly humbling. Meanwhile, my role subtly expanded. I didn't demand recognition, but the board recognized value when they saw it. I was now the go-to authority for any high-risk strategic decision, and my input wasn't just heard, it was acted upon immediately. Clients praised the company's renewed diligence, unaware that the man whose expertise they trusted was also orchestrating a quiet retribution against hubris and negligence. Every successful outcome became a small, almost invisible victory, a reminder of the balance restored. Then came the call from Charles Harper that truly underscored the story's final twist. "Raymond, we've been approached by a competitor," he said, voice deliberate. "They want to acquire Northridge. They've seen the restructuring, the reinforced compliance, the operational stability. They see value. They're willing to negotiate seriously, but they've asked for your assessment first." I didn't rush to respond. This was a test, not of corporate strategy, but of leverage. I reviewed their proposal carefully, analyzed risk, and drafted a recommendation that highlighted both opportunity and vulnerabilities. By the time I submitted it, the board was convinced. My guidance had preserved not only operational integrity, but also market advantage. Within days, the competitor backed away. They recognized that Northridge wasn't just a company, it was a system of experienced professionals, disciplined procedures, and enforceable accountability. The 15 executives, still reeling from past misjudgments, now understood that no amount of swagger or title could replicate years of expertise. And the real kicker? My patience, restraint, and careful orchestration earned me more than respect. It earned me tangible power. The board offered me the option to lead a new strategic division with full authority over risk management, resource allocation, and long-term planning. The salary increase was significant, but more importantly, the autonomy and influence were unparalleled. I accepted, not for ego, not for revenge itself, but because I understood that real control comes from knowing the system and using it wisely. Over the following months, Northridge thrived. Risk protocols were airtight. Client satisfaction soared. Projects previously derailed by oversight and arrogance ran flawlessly. And quietly, those executives who had once dismissed me now worked under new scrutiny, often collaborating with me, now aware that expertise and preparation were not optional, they were essential. The ultimate revenge had been subtle, patient, and complete. I hadn't humiliated anyone publicly, I hadn't leaked secrets or staged a dramatic confrontation. I had allowed their own decisions, their own arrogance, and the system itself to enforce accountability. The lesson was learned, and it was unforgettable. One afternoon, as I walked past the boardroom where so much had changed, I noticed a group of mid-level managers quietly discussing strategy. I paused for a moment, observing, and then smiled. The message was already spreading. Respect experience, prepare meticulously, and never underestimate someone who understands the system. That quiet wisdom would ripple through the company for years. And as for the 15 executives, some adapted, some quietly left, and a few remained, forever reminded that arrogance, when unchecked, carries consequences. Their reputations were intact, but humbled, their authority curtailed, and their pride tempered. Meanwhile, the company itself had gained resilience, clarity, and leadership that was both effective and accountable. In the end, my revenge wasn't about personal vindication. It was about ensuring that the right decisions were made, that experience was respected, and that the system functioned as it was designed. And in that, the payoff was complete. The company stabilized, careers shifted, and a lesson that would echo for years was permanently etched into Northridge Solutions.
15 executives had walked out. One man had stayed silent, patient, and strategic. And by letting the system do its work, by leveraging expertise over ego, he had orchestrated a quiet, unstoppable, and unforgettable revenge. Because in the corporate world, the most powerful revenge isn't loud. It's precise, patient, and carried out with the authority that only true experience can command. And sometimes the best victories are the ones that leave others quietly realizing their mistakes long after the room has emptied and the echoes of arrogance have faded.